some of you may have seen the show. I'm not sure if all of you have, but my partner Aussie and I like to say had the privilege, but in some ways, I don't know, that's debatable, of being on the Ultimatum Queer Love that came out last year already, but was recorded at the end of 2021, if I'm not mistaken. It feels like it was a long time ago. And so yeah, I was a very different person at the time while we were going through this process of kind of like interviewing. And there are certain things that I won't be able to share due to like NDA reasons, but yeah, we of course thought it was a scam, as I'm sure many people do, because you're just like kind of living your life, doing your thing. We probably had a good solid 200 followers on our Instagram account, and someone reached out to us, and so we had some natural skepticism as far as like, why us, like who are we even, like no one knows who we are. But someone found us and we ended up going through this process, and I think there was some level of like, oh my gosh, this is actually legit. Like we're actually applying for something, and this seems like we're getting so far along here, it doesn't seem like a scam anymore. And so yeah, we went through that, but at the same time, just personally and as part of our relationship, I think we kind of came together wanting to just talk about our relationship. And so I think it's interesting how this eventually came around, and this opportunity came to us to literally share a relationship in a very public way. And so yeah, there was a lot of debate for a long time as far as our participation, and we decided to go through with it, obviously, and here we are.
Great, thanks, Sam. So I have like a million questions, but I want to make sure that you all, class, students, have a chance to ask your questions. So go ahead and just unmute and ask away.
That's a great question, and it's a complex one in many ways, because we were essentially recording for like 2 months, right? And you see maybe an hour or less per episode for 10 episodes, and there were a lot of things that I had no idea that were happening with other people, and it actually wasn't until we were watching the episodes and we're like, oh, that's what was happening. Or like, oh, that's why that person was like that. And we had no idea. So there's a lot of things that I feel like it just can't possibly capture everything, because there's thousands and thousands of hours, and there's like so many individual people and households, and then we're switching, that it really is like they can essentially create a story any way that they want. And they probably have a million different options as to how they're going to play things out. And so I think in some areas, some of the disappointments, obviously the editing of Aussie, as well as the editing of Vanessa, those were ones that were really kind of hard, in the sense that they were essentially villainized in some ways. And a lot of us, or at least many of us, I would hope, kind of caught on to certain characteristics of people through the reunion. I think that was very telling of some of the personalities. And then it's funny that a lot of people saw the series over and over. Like it wasn't uncommon that people saw the whole series like 10 times, right? And so I think there was just so much to unpack with what they did show, that when you watch the reunion, it kind of makes sense as far as how some things played out, I think, in the regular episodes. One thing I wish they did more, and I'm still hoping that, somebody will think this is a great idea, but to redo the entire one into almost like a spin-off season where they just focus on like the queer part, or like the stories and the experiences, because there were so many amazing conversations that happened, that didn't obviously make it into the final versions. But there was a lot of like self-discovery and like really deep conversations about the queer experience. And I would have loved to see a lot more of that than was shown. Yeah. Thank you for this question. I think this is also very dependent on the person and also your sense of boundaries, honestly, moving into it. And so I think that, and I'm sure you can tell through the episodes that my experience is very different than like every other person. And everyone kind of had a I would say everyone had a different experience for a variety of reasons. And I was kind of grateful that I was working with like for me it was a spiritual mentor at the time, and she really like helped me mentally prepare for this even though she didn't fully know what I was going into. I didn't know what I was going into, and I don't think anyone knows until they're actually in it. But I think like my sense of boundaries may have been I don't want to just say like stronger necessarily, but I think I had a different sense of self than others may have. And even in terms of their participation within the show, their relationships, some people I honestly believe that the show came into their lives because they weren't meant to be together, and that was the catalyst that was going to do it for them. And so it can look different for everyone. I feel like another factor, because I feel like there's so many articles about this just for reality show in general, and the use of like substances or like alcohol, and I don't drink, and so that also I believe had an impact in terms of like my clarity perhaps in certain situations and being able to see things differently with a clear mind, right? And so yeah, I think it's hard to say the level of, I don't want to use the word manipulation by production or anything like that. But you know, sometimes it is like that sense of like there's this God and you don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. So I'm sure there's so much happening that none of us are aware of or would be aware of to know. But all I can say is it's very disorienting when you're kind of in this bubble. And so I think it would it would be an interesting situation for anyone to be in. And I think that that's showed by how maybe some people are reacting to certain situations or, yeah, the emotional states that people are in during some of the scenes. Yeah, I know that was long winded. Hopefully, I answered some of your question.
Thanks, Sam. Actually, I'm going to follow up with a question and then we'll get to another student question. So I'm just curious. So you said you filmed for like, I think you said 2 months of filming. So what could you give us a feel for like what your average filming day looked like in terms of schedule? And also tell us a little bit about compensation. Like, do you walk away from a show like The Ultimatum Queer Love with a paycheck or paychecks?
Yeah, so some of those I'm not supposed to talk about. But in terms of the days, what I can say is I am introverted. And so I get really burnt out by energy and people and just interacting with people. And so when we weren't filming, I kind of just wanted to like stay in the room or the apartment by myself and didn't really want to interact with anyone because it's just like it's a full day of interacting with people when you're filming, and you're having to like have conversations, and a lot of times they're like these deep conversations, and it can be again like tiring just like going from place to place or figuring out what's happening. And so yeah, I literally wanted to just be a homebody like anytime we weren't filming. And then especially with someone like Tiff, who is more extroverted, was always wanting to go out, and I'm like, I'll stay, like have fun. I'll see you later. And so yeah, like it was pretty tiring. They were really long days, and yeah, and I just wanted to like chill on the off days. I don't know if there was any other part of the question that I can maybe answer, but we're not really supposed to talk about anything compensation related. And in terms of actual work environment and things behind the scenes, we're not really supposed to talk much about that either.
All right. Yeah, that's so fascinating that you're bound to not disclose things like payment, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's good information for us just to have on its own. Um, and I was going to just add for your knowledge, Sam. So many of these students have watched a lot of the Queer Love season, but particularly they were assigned to watch the reunion episode in particular. So ideally, all or many of them have watched that episode. All right, let's take another student question.
And I'll clarify as well that Tiff identifies as non-binary. And so, oh, that was a very, that was definitely a moment. And there was a lot leading up to that. And so again, the amount of time that we spend filming is like significantly longer than the cut versions, and I guess the sequence of events leading up to that was like it was like a gradual build up over time. And I think because of my particular experience with Aussie and that, and like months and months process of kind of understanding the experience of Aussie with Mildred and like that particular situation. And I'm not saying this from like anybody was specifically like diagnosed or anything like that, but though like understanding that experience that Aussie had caused us to like explore a lot about narcissistic personalities or traits, and just like those toxic environments, and just in having a lack of safety. And so while we were filming, I just like started noticing all of these things go off in my brain of like seeing gaslighting, and just even for myself being very like in tune with people. Like Tiff was clearly very uncomfortable. Like you can tell there was this energy of just like being attacked, and that, you know, this person was very aggressive towards them, and there was like this helplessness and not being able to speak. And like, so I just kind of like over this entire conversation, it was just building up in like, oh, that's a thing, and that's a thing, and that's consistent. And like Aussie and I talked about this exact same thing. And so I just like I had this unique experience of it not being the first time that I've heard of some of these things or experienced some of them. And so because of all of those like YouTube videos and stuff that I was honestly watching over several months, I was like, okay, I know that. And also, mind you, the people around were basically falling for everything that was being said. I can see heads like nodding next to me, and I'm like, okay, this is like not okay. And if people in this room are like falling for some of these things and they're not seeing through it, then, you know, what is the world going to think if they see this? And so I almost like had this calling, like, you have to go and like let this person know that you are seen and heard by at least myself and Aussie, like at the very least, and like let them know that they're not like alone in that situation. And so that it was kind of like an overall buildup, and also just like educating myself on certain things and certain signs. And so then I was able to kind of like, yeah, take action, I guess, in that moment. I love this question also because I'm not being biased, but I've heard from so many people, whether they're queer identifying, LGBT identifying, or not, that they like loved our season so much more than the other seasons, and that it was just so much more interesting, and like they would absolutely choose it over the other ones. And like in many ways, it still followed a lot of the same, like, oh, it's a reality show. But then at the same time, there was a different level of like the types of conversations we had and like the depth of conversations that we have, the diversity in topics that we're talking about. And I think that a lot of people noticed that and they did recognize it. And it wasn't uncommon to have people, especially even those like in relationships, say that they would take hours to finish one episode because they would be pausing it every time there was a conversation and they would talk about it amongst themselves. And they were like using this as a tool to like talk about things in their own relationships. Another thing that I think is really cool is I would hear from so many therapists who would especially work with LGBTQ folks and say that like, oh my gosh, like I have like everybody is asking me if I've seen the show, and every single person is asking, and they're relating to the characters, and they're using things from the show to talk about their experiences within their therapy sessions. And so I feel like what it has done for a lot of the communities in terms of representation and even just the different types of conversations, it's like done a lot on that side of things. Again, there's a lot of aspects of it's still reality TV. Like, we're not gonna say it's not. But I think that it did bring something different that people weren't used to. And I jokingly say that I will only watch queer reality shows from here on out because that's just like, there's no going back for me now.
Particularly the scene, one of my favorite scenes of yours was the one of you and Tiff in the car, like shooting the shit and being funny and silly and it's honestly the moment where I was like, Sam, like that's the one I want to know and talk to. So, like tell us a little bit about like just how the organicness or non-organic of that creating that moment and what led up to that for you.
Yeah, I think that, well, you don't see a lot of this of me, I think, in the show, but especially for those who kind of get to know me, I do like to joke around a lot. I'm actually not as serious as I think I come off in a lot of the episodes. But again, it's like you're in this bubble and you don't know what's happening around you. And so there it is kind of different. But I think by the time we had that scene, like Tiff and I had absolutely known that there was like nothing happening between us. And, after we, of course, got through the whole dog situation and like, got to be on the same page about things and came to an understanding. And I think that that kind of built a certain level of like intimacy between us because it was like, all right, we got through this like big misunderstanding, this big thing, and there was a lot attached to it that now we can kind of just like relax and get to know each other. And I think that that was one of the scenes that I love because it really does show. I think the level of friendship that we were able to develop, and even in such a short time, but because we went through certain like deep conversations within the context of like the show, but these things can still apply to relationships and like really knowing other people in your life that you're, having these friendships with. And yeah, like honestly, like towards the last half of our marriage, our trial marriage, I think that was a lot of how we interacted with each other. We joked a lot, and we said we really hope we were going to be some comic relief in some of like all the heaviness. And I think that that was one of the scenes that showed that. I would not be able to answer any of the parts about like production and maybe what they did or didn't know, but what I can say, because it made it into the edits, is that, it did make it into the edits, right? So and clearly conversations continued after that point. And so I think I think anyone can kind of make certain, I don't know, judgments about, how things were handled. Is that, yeah, it clearly made it in. This, I don't believe I don't even think they had content warnings. I could be mistaken because I don't remember like actually looking for it. But yeah, there was actually a lot of people speaking up about it, like on social media and things like that, as far as how they handled it. And yeah, I can say that they probably could have handled it in a much different way than they did. And yeah, that was one of the biggest things is like, if you knew, why would you allow that? And clearly there was no real like stepping in the moments that it was happening. And so I think that's also kind of how things ended up happening. And Aussie and I talked about this later as well, that we were actually glad that one of us stayed in the room and one of us went, because then at least both of us kind of knew what was going on both sides. And so, yeah. Um, but that's probably as much as I can say. And I think you all get my drift. That's a great question. Um, I feel like this also comes back to one of the things that I mentioned earlier about, I think, the sense of self that someone has coming into it, or like their self reflections and maybe even life experience. Because at the time of filming, I want to say that the youngest person was maybe 24, and Aussie being the oldest, early 40s, right? So that's almost like a 20-year age gap between the youngest participants. And so I feel like that also played a factor in terms of maybe emotional capacity, or being able to hold certain feelings or having experiences in their past. I feel like between Aussie and I, well, I would say I was more in the middle of the age groups. I was in my early 30s at the time. And I think that was a bulk of the cast members, with, I believe, Lexi being the youngest. I think she was 24 at the time. And so it kind of depends on who it was coming from and what space they were in terms of like their own inner work, I want to say, and their own sense of boundaries. And so when coming into a lot of these situations, for those of you who had seen some of the dog scenes, for example, and we're like arguing about these things, and there's clearly like stuff going on. It was in these moments, like after those conversations, that when I was just kind of like left to my own thoughts and self-reflecting on what was happening, that I was able to kind of see beyond what was really happening. Because I found myself kind of pushing against, because it was like, why don't you believe me? Why don't you like understand me? Like, you don't know my prior experience. How can you say these things? And I was able to shift that into, clearly there's something going on that is causing this reaction in this person, and it actually has nothing to do with me. I know who I am, and I know my past experience. I know myself. And so I can stop letting this person tell me who I am, and I can like just stand in who I am and let this person have whatever, you know, feelings that they're having. And so that is kind of one of those turning points that we also had. And I think that that played a factor in things like the reunion, where certain hurts may have been coming up. They were just, in my opinion, maybe not processed yet, or unresolved feelings that were at play that weren't necessarily in the person's awareness. And so I hope that answers that question. I would say we don't communicate regularly or anything like that, but I would say Tiff and Vanessa are some of the cast members that we've stayed most in contact with. And I'm generally pretty neutral with a couple more, but I'll withhold those names for in order to keep private the ones that we don't communicate with. But I would say, yeah, Tiff and Vanessa for sure. And again, it's kind of funny because even like friends of mine and people that I know very well have a lot of feelings about, say, Vanessa, for example. And it's kind of funny because, in the sense, like, yeah, there are a lot of things, like she is like that. She is a very like, expressive person and very passionate about certain things, and a little bit chaotic at times. But when it comes to her, like as a person, she and Tiff, like they are some of the most authentic ones that we encountered, like in our personal experience. And obviously, we communicated with people in different levels during filming. But we're like, I personally value authenticity over inauthenticity. So I'm like, hey, you be you, but as long as you're you and you're not like harming anybody, like I'm good with that. But yeah, I can say that she definitely did get a really harsh edit, at least in the beginning. But she's a really cool person.
Actually, a lot of our conversation this semester has been focused around this concept of authenticity. So I was wondering actually if you could go a little deeper. I'm curious to explore the disconnect between what happened with Vanessa as she was projected on the screen and then like the Vanessa and are, have a authentic connection with. Like I'm just curious if you could speak to like what do you think happened there?
Yeah, these are all great questions. So thank you all. This is a lot of fun. One of the things that I know for a fact is that society in general views people who so-called speak well or are articulate or communicate in a certain way, like they kind of hold them to a higher like pedestal almost, or they respect them more, or there's just something about the way that people communicate that it's like society teaches us that they're almost like at a higher tier than others. And I feel like I don't know how much of these scenes are like apparent in the episodes or not. But there was like a lot of almost like bullying. I feel personally that it could be perceived as like bullying or manipulation that was happening behind the scenes, that I think that it kind of clouded people's judgments as far as how they perceived Vanessa. And so I feel like because we had the insight of what was happening and we got to see the full conversations, at least in some of these scenes where like we're all together. Obviously I don't know what's happening in the kind of separate conversations, but it was clearly like there was clearly a lot of manipulation happening. There was clearly a lot of people trying to almost pin people against her in a way, or like um create an idea of her. And so I definitely believe that played a part in how she was perceived and how some of the scenes came off, or like what people were saying about her. And I think from the beginning, like Aussie and I saw right through that. And so again, she was one of the ones that we both kind of tried to like support. And this scene was definitely in there where, we are talking at this one event and this whole group of people just walks away from us. And like that actually did happen. And it really did happen like that. And it was very like we're all talking and they just like out of nowhere just leave. Like that was very true to what actually happened in that moment. And our confusion was very real. And I still like don't know why that happened, but I got some insight through watching the show because I didn't know what was happening, on the other side of the wall and what was happening in these conversations. But yeah, like certain things like that, I think if you pay attention to some of the scenes, I think you'll kind of catch on to where some people are actually like, I feel like purposely trying to switch up narratives for their own kind of personal gain, or just to, I guess, help them cope with certain things that are happening. So yeah, I tried to act like everything was normal. On the back end. And so I want to say that I was pretty good about keeping it private. And even after filming happened, Aussie and I were really good about keeping our relationship status kind of like on the down low. And it was actually really funny to find out almost a year later that some of our friends were secretly questioning whether or not we were still together, but they were scared to ask us. And so it was kind of funny, but we were like, oh, we did a really good job at like, kind of hiding our status, because at the time we didn't know when it was going to be released. And we were like, it could be months, it could be a year. Like we had no idea. So we just didn't want to like, I guess, mess anything up or like give anything away. And yeah, so generally, I think a lot of people didn't really know that we left, and I was already kind of working primarily remote, and Aussie wasn't like really working at the time either. And so, and I think it was really hard. Anybody who was working a normal 9 to 5, it was like not really going to work, right? With filming and stuff. And so I think it was disruptive in some sense because I was literally gone from my home for 2 months. But then again, so many things were happening remotely anyways that I really could just like, I can be anywhere right now with my virtual background and no one would know. So yeah, not everybody really even knew when I was gone for 2 months.
So as far as I know, um, you two, you and Aussie are the only relationship that did end up on the other side together. I was wondering if you could just tell us the story of how you two, like you, more you than you and Aussie, but how you walked through this relationship challenge.
Walked or crawled, I don't know, however you want to perceive it. I would say how the show came out. Well, first of all, we had a lot of challenges given that when someone, meaning Aussie, is like in such a toxic situation for, like 2 weeks. I think that they were in that trial marriage for 2 weeks before Aussie left. And the way that the audiences perceived it was really harsh. And especially Aussie receiving a lot of backlash for it. And some of the things that I feel is a part of it is also just the lack of, especially Asian and AAPI stories within the media, and especially for queer identifying Asians in the media, that the world as a whole didn't really know what that looked like. And so it was almost like, yes, in some levels, people call it emotional exploitation. And on other levels, it's like, this is one of the first times that we're kind of seeing behind those closed doors of like what that internal struggle might look like for someone where you don't have that protective layer on, or where you don't have all that armor when you're walking outside of the door and you just have, all these eyes on you. And so I think like, in all honesty, I think like our relationship in general, like triggered a lot of people and caused a lot of emotions within them. And they had nowhere else to direct those feelings towards other than to a person or to our relationships or like to us as a couple. And so yes, in many ways, I feel like we were led to this for a reason, that there were certain things that, even just this platform for us to talk about our experiences. I think it was brought to us for many reasons. And um, on the other hand, it made our relationship very, very challenging after the fact, and there was a lot to unpack, a lot to work through. But our dedication was there, and our willingness to look at ourselves and work together on this, and not allow people who didn't even know us from like anywhere in the world to tell us that we shouldn't be together, or that this is a red flag and all of the things. It's like, we know ourselves best and we know our relationship best. And so I think we went into the show with an agreement that we were going to honor whatever was meant to happen from it. And so I think that even from the beginning, we kind of approached our participation in a different way than I think others may have going into it. And I feel like that made a huge difference in how things played out in the end.
And just one follow-up on that note. So when you say that you had an agreement with Aussie about honoring whatever would come, so that included the like that ultimatum option, right, where you would part ways.
Oh,
Was that
yeah. Yeah, it included the ultimatum option, and it included, what if we found a situation where we were in where we were like, this isn't working, and we didn't want to discount any opportunity to learn more about ourselves. It was always from the standpoint of ourselves first individually, relationship second. Whereas I think others may have approached it from like relationship first and really trying to figure out the relationship rather than what am I meant to get from this and what do I need to learn about myself and my needs in order to proceed with the relationship or not. And so I think that approach was just like something different. And I think it helped us a lot throughout the course of filming and then also after. I I am very appreciative of everything that had happened. Obviously, if you were to ask Aussie, it might be a different response. But I think for me, I'm so appreciative of like the platform that it gave us and the opportunity to meet so many people and I guess give voice to certain, I guess, communities, to different experiences, and just kind of like bring that representation. I feel like most people can tell that we're not your typical influencers. And we don't approach any of like our social media or like anything. And so I think maintaining that, like, again, authenticity of like what I want to do with this opportunity, there were a lot of like ego struggles because we're kind of taught like, oh, you go this route, then you go the influencer route, and then it's all about building collaborations and making money for clicks and like doing advertising and all the things. And we almost did none of that. One part because it's confusing, and we're not meant to know all of this stuff going into it because we're just two people, and coming from our own lives, and we're just being dropped into this thing. But I feel like it's just been so rewarding because like even being able to talk to all of you, like I wouldn't have had this opportunity before. And just, yeah, I feel like we knew what we wanted to do. And so in that period between filming and when the show came out, we were actually like scoping out organizations. We were like attending things and volunteering and seeing like, okay, which organizations are going to treat us like which ones might treat us differently because of being on the show, and which ones are like more genuine and authentic as well, and like we want to know what they're doing behind the scenes and how they actually are. And so we were kind of like scoping out who we were going to support and how we were going to do that. And we did that in the in between, because we knew that it was going to be more cluttered after. So I'm grateful that we did that. But because of that, yeah, we've been able to, I think, do a lot of good. I think we've been able to have a lot of meaningful conversations and participate in a lot of things that help us just, get more stories out there for people to identify with and to resonate with. We're very limited in kind of like our interactions in a sense. But at the same time, what was really nice is that we actually did have very diverse crews for the most part. And like the people that we got to work with, a lot of people in the LGBT community, a lot of different like gender identities and gender expressions and different experiences and things like that. And so I really loved a lot of the people that we got to work with, to be honest. And what I know now too, just kind of understanding the industry a little bit better, a lot of times the people who are like driving you around or like helping to get meals, like they're just like trying to advance their career or get some experience. They're not there to, like come and destroy our lives or whatever. And I know even just through like researching online, so this wouldn't necessarily just be like insider information, you can just Google it. But there are certain shows that are very much not like that. And there are some shows where people talk about where it is a very controlled environment and a lot of things are staged, and you just can't trust anything or anyone. And to an extent, like we can't do that with that either, because like even on our show, you just never know. And you don't really want to let your guard down. But I genuinely liked like I could see us like hanging out, you know, just to like go grab a bite to eat or something. Like there were a lot of really cool people that we got to work with and meet. I think also I had a lot of experience with this before because my prior relationship was a completely like not able like I was out but my partner wasn't either and that was like a 4-year relationship and so when it comes to like I guess with Aussie's family in context that wasn't the first time I'd ever experienced that and I wasn't kind of like new to it but the difference was like when the family is living in the same general like area and Aussie's family being like across the continent. So in some ways I don't really feel like there's any hiding necessarily because it's not like I'm just gonna go to a grocery store and like run into somebody, right? And so that hasn't necessarily put like stress on me. But again, Aussie would probably come from a very different perspective. Whereas my family has been really good about their acceptance and being yeah, I was even surprised by some people who had seen the show. Honestly, like my 70 something year old aunt was trying to watch it and I was like lightly horrified, but then also like really excited of like, oh, you want to watch it. And you know, one of my uncles even. And so things like that, it's kind of cool that it's also like engaging so many people I never would have thought, and that I would have been afraid to kind of have them see into this part of my life. And so I think in many ways I've been pleasantly surprised by it. And yeah, it's been interesting, but in a cool way.
Thanks, Sam. I have one follow-up question. I was wondering if you could speak to, so in the setup of the show, like it seems as though monogamy is the relationship structure that's kind of prioritized, but then you also see this really interesting kind of dynamic where Yoli falls for two people at the same time, depending on how much you're really going to buy into those feelings, which I mean, to me, they came across as pretty genuine. And I'm just wondering if because polyamory and non-monogamy was named once or twice in the show as it aired, but it wasn't really given much airtime and is a thing that's very common and especially within, queer circles of queer love. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, this is another great question. All of your questions have been great. But I don't actually know if Yoli considers herself polyamorous or like I don't actually know the answer to that question. But I have actually explored a lot into different relationship types and styles in my lifetime. And so I feel like I can also approach this from having explored it personally, like years ago, is when I kind of like was introduced to the ideas and I would read books and blogs and I just love human behavior. And so I love anything that I can listen to different people's experiences. And this is one of them. And one of the things that I would say about that is part of me feels like maybe Yoli was not, or just cast members in general, not just specifically Yoli, may not have been really exposed to polyamory or like different relationship styles. And so I feel like if they had some of the tools for having certain conversations, things may have played out very differently. So, for example, in some different non monogamous relationships, like some people have like rules that they, you know, kind of guide the relationship of how they're going to hold their boundaries and how they're going to deal with like bringing people into the relationship or how is the structure going to happen. And I feel like that language to have those conversations could have helped solve a lot of these feelings of needing to like keep things secret or not be able to talk about it or not be able to talk and express like, hey, I'm actually having these feelings. But what we end up seeing is like this secrecy and this like inability to fully express like, hey, like there's something actually happening. And so then it ends up coming off as like deception, and it's perceived as just like keeping these secrets and lying to the partner, and just all of these misconceptions happening, and it gets really messy. And so I actually feel like if they had those tools to have these conversations, things could have been so much smoother and everyone could have stayed friends, and they could have just like taken it as a learning experience, and like, what is it that you feel like you're missing from our relationship that you're maybe seeking from this other person, or like what are they bringing into your life that you're feeling like you're not getting from me? And like, they just could have navigated it very different. And so I think that played a big factor as far as that. And I think too, we're also kind of held to whoever's doing the editing or producing or putting those storylines together. If they don't really have the language either, they're not going to know how to tell the stories in a way that is not confusing to the viewers. And so I think that a lot of it is just like a general lack of awareness and education in terms of some of these like broader conversations. Unfortunately, I probably can't answer any part of that question. And also, you don't always know who's working for who. So, like, you might see bodies, but I wouldn't really know, if they're like a third party or a contractor or part of Netflix or what their role is. So, to an extent, I wouldn't even know how to answer some of the question.
I'm wondering, so there's this idea, there's this perception with reality television that folks who are on there are like plucked out of their ordinary lives, right? Kind of like you described you and Aussie. And so to a certain extent, I think there's some truth to that, especially just from your example. But also like you're doing you're in front of a camera, you're in front of many cameras, you're getting a lot of visibility, you're performing in a particular way. So I was wondering if any of you had any acting experience or experience being on a set in the same way that you all were for your season.
Um, Between Aussie and I, not exactly, especially Aussie, less so than myself. I've never been in any kind of like production or anything like that before, but I did kind of grow up in some ways, like in the performing arts. So, like, I at least had some level of like experience being on a stage, or speaking into a mic in front of an audience, or taking pictures with people or being filmed, but not necessarily in that way. And so I think this is part of one of the questions that was asked earlier that I may not have fully touched on. But the conversations themselves are pretty genuine. Like, we may have certain topics that we're talking about, or we may have certain guidance as far as like what the theme is of this conversation or something. But for the most part, as far as us like speaking, the conversations themselves are authentic. But then, it's where the editing comes in that it might take away some of that authenticity, or things could potentially be moved around or changed however it is and manipulated. But when we're in these conversations, at least for me, it does kind of give this sense of like the cameras in the background kind of disappear, and I am just like in this conversation with this person, and we are just kind of like present with each other in whatever we're discussing and talking about. So yeah, definitely nothing like this, but I have some like removed experience with something maybe related.
And just to follow up to that, were there nerves for you like leading up to the experience of being a performer on that new level?
I think because of the commitments that, Aussie and I try to make for ourselves or hold to ourselves in terms of being ourselves and being committed to the process of, not even communicating with each other throughout those trial marriages. And in the moments that we weren't supposed to have communication, like we held those boundaries. And I think this is already common knowledge for the most part. I've heard it said. But I'd like to say that Aussie and I were the ones who committed to the process the most in terms of almost zero communication in the times that we weren't meant to communicate. I know that, like, when people are communicating, they're also breaking each other's boundaries in terms of, like, you're meant to have your experience with this person, and I'm meant to have my experience with this person. If we're talking to each other, we're disrupting that process, we're interrupting it. And also, a lot of that could come from a sense of like lack of trust, or just like wanting to control the situation, or like, don't forget about me, I'm still here kind of thing. And so they're like, you're also embedding all of these things, I think, like subconsciously or like unintentionally by communicating. And so I actually think that's one of the other reasons that we ended up being one of the successful ones, is because we actually did stick to those boundaries, and we did kind of like go through the process as it was meant to be gone through. And I'm forgetting what your initial question was already because I sidetracked, but I don't know if I answered
I think
it.
you answered it. Yeah, I think you
Okay.
answered the full question. Thanks.
I can answer a part of this, in that wherever we were filming, I mean, just with anything, there's certain like papers that need to be signed and getting certain permits, I'm assuming, or licenses, whatever needs to be done. And so the scenes had to be set up on the back end. So we didn't specifically say like, oh, we're gonna like meet here, or like I want to meet here. And so there was some level of like they have to set up certain things for filming. And even if it's like a certain location that has to be kind of closed off or blocked off to other people. um but yeah, I also think it was funny, this unfortunately didn't make it into the final cut, but my friend Charmaine, when we first went on set, that was actually our first time ever meeting in person. We met during the pandemic, and Charmaine, Aussie, and I had all met each other through an online meetup group during the pandemic. And so that was our first time meeting in person. So it was kind of cool that, she got to fly out and come meet. And yeah, I think I was one of the only people that like did not tell her what was happening. I think everyone to some extent at least like told their people that were coming on of like generally what was happening, and I kind of did not tell her anything. And like I wish this could have made it in, but it was like the best reaction to like literally having no idea what was happening when I introduced her to Tiff. So
I was curious. So, in this class, we talk a lot about like power and the power of representation, the power of the image, um, and and generally as a whole, our tone has been kind of down. Like it's hard to see what can happen. Like it's hard to see reality television as a space for positive cultural and social movement. Though you've kind of spoken to some of the ways in which that's maybe some exceptions to that. So I was wondering if you could just like speak to that a little bit, dive a little deeper into like what are some of the ways in which you've been able to kind of galvanize this platform and participate in ways like politically, socially, culturally that are significant in a broader like to our broader human landscape.
this is a really interesting question, and I'll try to get as much as I can in a short amount of time. Um, but I feel like part of it is just like this invisible pressure to fall in line with the systems that are already in play. And what I mean by that is kind of like that influencer lifestyle that posting content to get engagement and to increase followers and all of the things. And um, because I had already been going on like a DEI journey, or like the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, and all the things, and I had gone through like a leadership programs and things like that. And so coming into it, I feel like it was really important to me and like my kind of image and branding to hold that like authenticity and that integrity like very close. And I actually would tell some of my friends like, so if I start like going off the rails, please bring me back to center. Like if I start to lose my way, like please help ground me. And like I invited people to do that. And luckily I didn't really need any reminders, but like I also wanted to make sure, because I knew that it can be so easy to fall into like, oh, gotta get all of this engagement so that I can, talk to brands, and then I can do this, and then I can make all this money and do the things. And then all of a sudden you're like losing sight of like, why am I doing this? And why we were doing this was to bring the authenticity, to bring representation, to have these conversations, and to show that there's another way that we can use these platforms regardless of how things come out. Now, I definitely got a good edit, but at the same time, I also give myself credit for holding to my authenticity within filming, that they weren't going to have enough to spin me in a bad way, right? Like to an extent, they have to have the things to manipulate in order to. So if I'm like yelling at people, they can't, and like I can't say like, no, I wasn't doing that, but maybe it's without context. But in that sense, it's like I didn't want to give them any fuel anyways to be able to like put me in this light. And so I'm like talking myself in circles because I feel like there's so much that I have to say about it. But I did have to really do like ego checks, because you can get so wrapped up into it and be like, oh, like I'm growing followers, and like when are we gonna, like how is this all gonna play out, and what do I need to do? But like that's not me. I don't like following trends. I don't like having to like research things. It just takes the fun away from it. And so I did need to like ego check myself many times and like sit with these uncomfortable feelings. And I'm like, part of my thing is to bring representation. So I am going to talk about politics, and I am going to talk about, social injustices, and I am going to talk about these things that people don't necessarily want to hear about all the time unless they're on that journey themselves. And really just like reminding myself, when people fall away, which they did, when I started to be more vocal about certain things that people didn't always want to see from a so-called influencer or somebody who was supposed to be an influencer, um, like they did fall away. And I did see like people like in the hundreds. But then after a certain point, I started to appreciate them falling away, because I'm like, I don't really need your energy anyways. If you're not here for this type of stuff, then I don't know if I would even want to have a conversation with you anyways. And so it was also just kind of like holding true to myself and like remembering what the truth is, which is, am I aligning with the people that I want to, or am I just trying to like, inflate my ego and tell myself that like, oh, I can get more followers from this, or like I can gain something. And it's really just like detaching from that and just speaking my truth, and speaking truths that other people may not have a platform for, and trying to lift them up with whatever, privilege that I do have from this. I used to watch a lot of reality TV before I was on it. And then, like I mentioned earlier, I have to say, um, I still do love our season very much, and not just for the content, but also like what I feel like it has done in a sense for the industry. That even though there's a lot to work on behind the scenes, from like what reality TV is and how production is, and like there's a lot on that, and I'm sure again you can all look that up. I don't have to I don't have to say anything more about the conditions of some of the shows. But I really do think that it was a starting point or like a turning point for what reality TV can be and opening up to different types of conversations and how you don't just need to be of a certain experience to find something within it. And I think that it really did do that for a lot of people. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. This conversation has been like wholly illuminating. Never before I've taught reality television a number of many, many times, and never before have I had the pleasure of having an actual reality television cast member speak to my students. So, really helpful. It really is so helpful to give us that inside view into the goings on, and in particularly in the show, in your particular show, where you kind of meet reality television meets marginalized population, and what can happen there, like what the struggles, the challenges, and the like huge cultural movement that's still ongoing. So thank you so much for this time, and thanks everyone. Thanks for participating. Great questions today.
Thank you.